But again, there's like, to your point, there's so much wisdom that can be extracted from those lived experiences that they have.
Right.
But to your point, if we don't create those environments to actually share that information with each other, then it essentially gets lost, right? Because mom and dad could have gone through stuff, but we will never know, right? Because they might be guarded, and then that inherently might make us guarded, or we're more reserved and conservative, so then we don't end up opening up about these things.
Right.
What's the net effect? I might go through some hardship that I probably didn't have to. Might get my heart broken more times than I probably had to. Might end up making some silly mistakes that I probably didn't have to.
Right.
So my whole point is, and I'm also a father, and so I think a lot about the stories that you don't share, the experiences that you don't bring up. The kids, the next generation is like, they don't get the benefit of any of that. Which is, listen, and I want to make a point because I think that's very important. And that point, I can totally empathize with you. So for those that may not remember, so I grew up predominantly with my father. And as many men have attested to, we don't come from experiences where it's like comfortable to share how you feel. And so naturally, my dad taught me to kind of just like keep everything in and kind of suppress it, right? But again, there's like, to your point, there's so much wisdom that can be extracted from those lived experiences that they have.
Right.
But to your point, if we don't create those environments to actually share that information with each other, then it essentially gets lost, right? Because mom and dad could have gone through stuff, but we will never know, right? Because they might be guarded, and then that inherently might make us guarded, or we're more reserved and conservative, so then we don't end up opening up about these things.
Right.
What's the net effect? I might go through some hardship that I probably didn't have to. Might get my heart broken more times than I probably had to. Might end up making some silly mistakes that I probably didn't have to.
Right.
So my whole point is, and I'm also a father, and so I think a lot about the stories that you don't share, the experiences that you don't bring up. The kids, the next generation is like, they don't get the benefit of any of that, you know? And I'm not saying like, when we present those stories and those information, you're gonna help them avoid everything, because that would be foolish, right? Kids are still gonna make mistakes. Everybody, adults, we're still gonna make mistakes. But it maybe doesn't have to be as much as it does.
Right.
What would you think in response to that? What would you say?
I would agree. Like, some of the things that I bring up to them now as an adult, they've helped me out with. So I could only imagine, like, if I was to present them with some issues that I had back then, I could have avoided, like you said, a lot of heartbreak, a lot of disappointments, right?
That's a big one right there.
Yeah. So, and you know, they have and they're willing to share. It's just a matter of, am I being vulnerable enough to share this stuff with them and to ask these questions?
Yeah.
And now I'm grateful for the relationship that we do have, because I speak to them about things and I'm more open now than I was back then.
That's good.
Yeah. So
I'm curious on that thought though. When did that change? Like, when did you, because you said there was a point. It was kind of like we weren't talking about nothing, and then all of a sudden we're talking about things. So when did that happen for you in your life?
I think it was more of like when I kept experiencing like different hardships, and through trusting them with it, and I became more comfortable.
Okay.
Because of how they received it.
Okay.
I didn't feel like they would like judge me or, you know, things like that.
Okay.
So it was more of, hey, like, I can feel comfortable enough to go to them with that. I know that, you know, they'll handle it well. Like, they're not going to blow up on me, or
Right.
I'm not going to like, I won't disappoint them with what I shared.
Okay. Kind of testing the, like, so you're saying, so you kind of gone through some experiences, and then based on how they responded, maybe you sort of tested the waters
And
then
shared more.
Right. So they responded favorably, and then over time you allowed them in gradually more.
More, yes.
And then vice versa, they were also mirroring that with you?
Yes, I would say so, yes.
Okay. So if I'm understanding that correctly, I think that that's beautiful that that happens, right? Because obviously we want to get to a point where that's the case for all of us. But what's interesting is you said, so it took me getting to a certain point and going through certain things, though, for us then to have this kind of come to Jesus moment where we actually want to talk about stuff. Do you think it would have been possible? I know we can't fortune tell and look back to the future, but do you think it would have been possible had y'all maybe had that more open type of relationship where y'all were sharing more? That maybe whatever hardships you did go through, not all of them,
Mm-hmm.
do you think maybe some of them maybe could have been alleviated?
It was more, possibly yes, but back then we weren't ready to be open with one another.
Okay.
Because I was afraid of how they would see me, or how they would react.
Like depending on what you came to tell them about?
Yes, like for example, the day I was an adult, and I got my lip pierced.
Oh.
And my dad was so mad. He almost disowned me. I'm like, I'm an adult, and I actually really like my lip piercing, but he didn't take that well, right? So, my belly pierced, same thing. So the way that he reacted,
he was more conservative about those things, so he didn't like it.
Oh, for sure.
Okay.
Like, tattoos wasn't a big thing.
That's always a big one for us.
Yeah, but all my brothers got tattoos, so.
No, but and to be fair, that's definitely I think that's definitely an unfair double standard that happens. Mm-hmm. Where, especially again, I've seen more on immigrant sides where it's like, especially if they're any type of devoutly religious.
Yeah.
It's like any type of tattoo is like you're desecrating your body, so you shouldn't do those things. But yeah, I think there is an unfair double standard when it comes to men and women, because some of those things, like the son can kind of get away with, daughters are like, you're supposed to be maybe a little more pure, so they don't want to see you portraying yourself that way.
Yeah. So that was a big deal for me. Like when I got when I finally, like when they saw my piercings and they were like, well, what are you doing? And like, basically kicked me out the house. And I was like,
How long ago was that?
That was probably like freshman year of college, I would say.
Okay.
Yeah.
So beginning of like kind of coming into your own, starting to figure out like, who am I? Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fair. And it's interesting when you say that, because sometimes when I'm trying to break up these points and we're kind of exploring how our culture defines the way we see the world, right? What you're talking about is how the way you grew up, the country of origin your family is from, and the religious aspect when you put those together, and then also layering that by being here in the States and maybe an extra layer of pressure of like to be that good quote unquote like immigrant person, student, family. It seems like a lot of that might have added like an additional cultural pressure that maybe not some people can relate to and maybe others don't. Would you say that there could be some truth to that?
Absolutely, yes. And even with, like you said, with the boys, right? They were a lot more lenient with them, I felt like. Sometimes they want to go out. They're like, all right. And me, I'm like, where are you going? I'm like, I'm going, not with him, but I'm going somewhere else. I'm going out too. What? No, where are you going? And then they wonder, certain parents, sometimes they may wonder, okay, well, later on when you're an adult, well, where's your boyfriend? It's like, you didn't let me go out. Like, where am I supposed to come up with this person?
You didn't give me an opportunity to go meet these persons.
Yeah, so it was interesting.
That is it. So is it safe to say then that your brothers were allowed to kind of go out, do more or less what they wanted to do? And you're saying you had a much more restricted environment where if you did want to explore like things like dating, you weren't really allowed to? Yeah,
we were restricted. Some of us, like, my eldest brother he just did his own thing. Eventually, I felt like the repercussion was like less for them. Yeah. It's like for me, or maybe I took it that way, right? Maybe I perceived it that way, where it's like, oh, they see me a certain way now, or, I'm not their little girl anymore, or look at how they're that upset with me. They're that disappointed with me. It may just be the way I was looking at it, right? Okay. But I did feel back then like my brothers had had it easier kind of thing when it came to going out, stuff like that.
So they gave them a little more leeway. You were kind of like shorter chain.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So, and we'll circle back to that, because I think that's important, because that's certainly, I can imagine, play a huge impact, like you said, on how you're going to try to be able to find somebody if you're growing up in a space where you're not really given the freedom to explore that, maybe someone in your earlier years. It's naturally going to get harder, right? The older we get, the more that we don't do something, it doesn't typically get easier the more we avoid it or are not afforded the opportunity to do it, right?
Right.
So I think that's a perfect example of, or at least how I would say it, that openness to me about when we have children and we want to be able to give those experiences it's because if you don't want them to make the same pitfalls, so obviously you're not my daughter, but let's just say I had a daughter for an example, and her mom had a few boyfriends before me. I think that it helps not only by the father and the mother helping to instill good values of what you should expect from like a young man, right? But being able to have that open dialogue of like, this is what I'm experiencing, this is how this person's approaching me, this is what I'm dealing with, like, how should I interpret that?
Right. Yeah.
You know, like, because then you start talking, and I'm trying not to go off on a tangent, but you start thinking about like your value, what do you expect? How do you determine your respect? How do you determine your moral compass, if you will? So I know how that man should approach me and approach my family if he wants to be taken seriously, maybe by my family.
Right.
You know what I mean? All these like nuanced discussions, I noticed that in many cases, like, they don't really get discussed.
Yeah.
Right? It's kind of like implicit, like you're supposed to kind of know. And I think that's why sometimes like people tend to stay in their own little cultural community, because then you don't have to maybe explain as much.
Yeah, I would say the one thing though is that, you know, my parents, family, extended family, they always, you know, told me to respect myself, make sure other people respect me.
Yeah.
So they did emphasize on that, you know, and I guess that's with our actions as well.
Right.
So how someone would approach you goes back to the respect. How do you carry yourself? Back to the respect. So if we do something off, they would call it out,
Okay.
but not necessarily have that dialect like you said.
So kind of like just giving you the initial, like, hey, maybe that's not okay or that's not appropriate, but then maybe you're not getting as much of the details of like why it's not okay. Why was it not appropriate? Why did the way this guy approached me not be the way you would prefer it to happen?
And what would be better? What would be an example of being better? Yeah.
And okay. Yeah, those are the things I'm like always so genuinely curious about. Like, and maybe I'm losing my mind, but in my mind, like, I'm a man, right? I would think if I had a daughter, I would want to tell her these things about how courtship and dating might be with a young man, and what I think she deserves and what I think she should expect. Not only because of how I would treat her, but we would need to have some level of dialogue. No? I mean, yeah, her mom can talk about it, sure, but her mom can talk about it from the woman's perspective. I would also want to give the guy's perspective so she can kind of understand, well, my dad said, like, a man should come at me this way, and if he's not, then I kind of know he probably not take him seriously. Like, let's keep it moving.
Right.
And then vice versa if it's your son, right? Maybe you want the mom to be like, well, this is how I would treat you. I'm not saying she's going to be me, but these are some elements that she should have. These are some intrinsic values that she should hold to know that she's good for you. Does that make sense?
Yes, and this happens now. So as I said, we're open about it now. My mom, my dad, but my brothers too. So we have these dialects. You know, hey, well, he did this, so I don't know, like, what's going on with that? Like, what kind of, you know, man does that? See where that goes, and so we're having these dialects more often now.
No, that's good. I mean, I think, to me, like, that's the whole purpose of why I would want us, and I'm trying to encourage us in having these discussions, to have more of an open forum where we're not just holding all this information in, or making the other members of the family perhaps like feel uncomfortable, like they're not supposed to talk about it. So, because then a lot of times, like, and again, we're going to get into this on the therapy side, you kind of ask yourself, like, well, then where do I go? Like, where am I supposed to get this information from? And then you got young people now. That's why they're going to social media.
Yeah, YouTube.
Because they don't know where else they're supposed to get it. Like, if I can't talk to the people that took me into this world, that brought me here, then who else am I supposed to feel comfortable enough to share it with? Yeah. So then you're seeking that validation on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook and all, you're just trying to be like, man, let me get it wherever I can. Or maybe you're not getting quality information, and that might really skew your perception. That might have some really disastrous impacts for the long term.